one's titled Truth in Children's Books. And we're excited to welcome award-winning author Adam Gidwitz.
Adam Gidwitz is the best-selling author of a tale dark and grim Newbery-honored novel, The Inquisitor's Tale, and the forthcoming Max in the House of Spies.
Arush, did you know that he's also creator of the #1 podcast for kids? Grim, Grimmer, Grimace.
Wow, that's actually incredible. If you haven't heard of Adam Gidwitz, he's the creative mind behind Max in the House of Spies, the first book in the thrilling duology set during World War II. It's fast-paced, hilarious, and filled with heart as only Adam can deliver.
The story follows Max, a young boy who's left home for the first time, alone and trying to survive in a dangerous world. But he's got some unusual traveling companions, a kobold and a diebuck named Berg and Steen, on each shoulder guiding him along his way.
Oh, and did I mention? Max's plan to reunite with his parents in Berlin involves becoming a British spy. It's a story about impossible odds, bravery, and the power of friendship, plus a bit of magic along the way.
And through all this, Adam explores deeper truths about choices, identity, and survival in uncertain times. He'll be discussing how children's books like this help young readers navigate complex issues in life, like what's right, what's wrong, and finding your way in this chaotic world that we live in.
So without further ado, please join us in welcoming Adam Gidwitz.
Thank you. That was a wonderful introduction. I'm very honored and thrilled to be here today. Can you hear me in the back? Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, excellent. It is an amazing honor to be here at Neve Academy, to be here in India. I have visited India only once before. I loved it, but I was in the north, not in the south. And I've had an incredible experience here. And one of the things that I've noticed while I've been here is the amazing generosity of everyone that I have met. There was a wonderful reception at the house of our hosts last night. People were so warm and generous. But also, a few hours earlier, I went to the KR market, and everyone was warm and generous there. And I got to shake about 10,000 hands, and everyone asked me where I was from. And so I'm just very honored to be here speaking with all of you today. So thank you for inviting me to be here. Yes, thank you. Thank you to our hosts. So yes, these are some of my books. I'm going to talk about the question of truth in children's literature today. And I have my notes on my computer, which I do not have with me. So if I forget what I'm talking about, I apologize. Are you ready? Let's do it. So the question... Can I get this to work? Yes. The question that I wanted to ask all of you today, and that I will be exploring, is, should books for young people be entertaining, or should books for young people explore difficult truths? Which should we be aiming for as writers, as librarians, as teachers, when we are choosing and creating books for young people? So, I explore this in my books through various ways. So first, let me start. Oh, wait, jumped ahead. So this is me when I'm in the 7th grade. Is anyone here in 7th grade? Yes, we have some 7th graders? Okay. So I just have to tell you, this haircut, when in 1995 in the United States, was very popular, okay? I know it looks ridiculous now, but in 1995, that was a cool haircut, okay? So don't judge me. So when I was in 7th grade, I had an author come to my school, very much like today. I don't remember the name of the author. I don't remember any books the author wrote. In fact, I don't remember anything the author said, except for one thing. Somebody asked the author, "How do you know if you're a writer?" My ears perked up. I was curious. I didn't think I would be a writer when I grew up. I was pretty sure I'd be a professional basketball player. That did not work out for me. I don't know why. Anyway, the author thought about it, and she said, "How do you know if you're a writer?" And then she said, "Writers write." And I was like, obviously. But then I thought about it. I was like, okay, maybe she's got a point. Writers write. Well, do I write? Well, I write in school, and my teachers tell me to. I write for homework when I remember to do my homework, which was not very often. But do I write on my own for fun? Because I figured that's what she meant. The answer was, no, I never did. And so I decided on that day in 7th grade that I was not a writer and that I never would be. And I was sure of it. And every time I got an idea for a story, because everybody gets an idea for a story sometimes, right? You're walking down the street and you see an old lady, and you're like, wouldn't it be cool if that old lady turned humongous and attacked a city or something like that? The answer is yes, that would be a great story. But I would always write like a paragraph or two, and I would always quit and be like, psh, who am I kidding? I know I'm not a writer. But I'm here today. I wrote a bunch of books, which I showed you before. So how did that happen? Well, what I did like to do when I was a kid was I liked to play with action figures. Do you guys know what action figures are? Like little toys, like little dudes with like masks and weapons, and they're little men who fight. If you know what Barbies are, they're like little Barbies with weapons, okay? So I used to play with these action figures all the time, and it would always go the same way. I would take one in each hand, and one was usually the cool kid from school, and the other one was me, not the cool kid. And the cool kid would say something mean and funny to me, and all the other action figures would laugh. And then my action figure would go and beat him up, and I would feel good about myself. So I used to do this for like hours a day when I was a kid. Eventually, I went away to college. I became a teacher, and I started writing stories for children. And when I write my stories down, I type them and I tell them out loud. And one day, I was telling a story out loud and typing it, and I suddenly realized telling a story out loud and typing it is just about exactly the same thing as telling a story out loud and going like this with my action figures. And I realized I had been a writer my whole life. I spent every day, 2 or 3 hours a day, writing stories. I never wrote any of them down, but they're the same. It's the same thing I do now, except now I get paid for it. So if you find yourself doing things like talking to yourself, telling yourself stories, playing, maybe you're out on a soccer field kicking a soccer ball and narrating like who you are, like the star that you are on the soccer pitch, that's being a writer. And you can write it down now, or you can wait till later to write it down. But you're already a writer if you're doing that. So I'm going to come back to that idea a little bit later. But let me talk to you a little bit about some of my books and about this question of like, should kids' books be entertaining or should they explore hard truths? So let's see if this clicker works. It did. Okay. So these books, A Tale Dark and Grim, In a Glass Grimly, The Grim Conclusion, they are based on Grimm's fairy tales. A lot of people think Grimm's fairy tales are cute and sweet stories for little kids. But the real Grimm fairy tales like, you've heard of a lot of them. Let's check it out. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of a story. We're going to do a little silent survey. So I need everyone to loosen up your shoulders. Loosen them up. Let me see. I only see a few shoulders going. I need more shoulders, more shoulders. Okay. Silently raise your hand if you have heard of a story called Little Red Riding Hood. Hands? Okay, very good. Hands down. That story was collected by the Brothers Grimm. And so we know it because they wrote it down. Let's do another one. Raise your hand if you've heard of a story called Snow White. Okay, very good. Sleeping Beauty. Cinderella. Rapunzel? Rumpelstiltskin? The Mouse, the Bird, and the Sausage? You have not. Liars. It's like a whole bunch of liars back there. Just kidding. Okay, so those are all Grimm fairy tales. And you're probably thinking, well, like, I know Snow White, that's like, or Little Red Riding Hood, and that's like a sweet and cute story for little kids. But the real Grimm fairy tales are not like that at all. They're quite dark, and they're quite grim. And I wanted to write stories like that because I wanted to explore difficult truths. So I'm going to read to you just the first one page of this book. Well, it's actually 2 pages. Okay. Once upon a time, fairy tales were awesome. I know, you don't believe me. I don't blame you. A little while ago, I wouldn't have believed it myself. Little girls in red caps skipping around the forest? Awesome? I don't think so. But then I started to read them, the real grim ones. Very few little girls in red caps in those. Well, there's one, but she gets eaten. Okay, you're probably saying, if fairy tales are awesome, why are all the ones I've heard so unbelievably, mind-numbingly boring? Well, you know how it is with stories. Someone tells a story, then somebody repeats it and it changes. Someone else repeats it and it changes again. Then someone's telling it to their kid and taking out all the scary, bloody scenes, in other words, the awesome parts. And the next thing you know, your story's about an adorable little girl in a red cap skipping through the forest, taking cookies to her granny, and you're so bored you have passed out on the floor. The real Grimm stories are not like that. Take Hansel and Gretel, for example. Two greedy little children try to eat a witch's house, so she decides to cook and eat them instead, which is fair, it seems to me. But before she can follow through on her perfectly reasonable plan, they lock her in an oven and bake her to death, which is pretty cool, you have to admit. But maybe it's not awesome. Except, and here's the thing, that's not the real story of Hansel and Gretel. You see, there is another story in Grimm's fairy tales, a story that winds all throughout that moldy, mysterious tome, like a trail of breadcrumbs winding through a forest. It appears in tales you may never have heard, like Faithful Johannes and Brother and Sister, and in some you have, Hansel and Gretel, for instance. It is the story of two children, a girl named Gretel and a boy named Hansel, traveling through a magical and terrifying world. It is the story of two children striving and failing, and then not failing. It is the story of two children finding out the meanings of things. Before I go on, a word of warning. Grimm's stories, the ones that weren't changed for little kids, are violent and bloody. And what you're going to hear now, the one true tale in the tales of Grimm, is as violent and bloody as you can imagine, really. So if such things bother you, we should probably stop right now. You see, the land of Grimm can be a harrowing place, but it is worth exploring. For in life, it is in the darkest zones one finds the brightest beauty and the most luminous wisdom. And, of course, the most blood. All right, so that's the beginning of A Tale Dark and Grim, and it may give you a little hint as to what I think the answer to my question was at the beginning, but we'll come back to that in a little bit, because I want to talk about the next book, The Inquisitor's Tale. So, this book is about three children who live in the Middle Ages in Europe. They live in the 1200s in Europe, and each one has a special power. There is a girl who has visions of the future. There is a boy with incredible strength. There is another boy who heals people's wounds with his hands. And there is a holy dog. And the dog is holy because in the first chapter of the book, spoiler alert, the dog dies. In the second chapter of the book, the dog comes back to life. Because I hate it when dogs die in books. It's the worst thing ever. And it's only okay if you bring them right back to life. So the dog will be fine, I promise. And they go on just crazy adventures. I'm going to tell you a little bit about one of the adventures, which is one of the things that inspired me to write this book. My wife is a professor of medieval history. And we were actually at a museum. And we found this box. There was this box with some drawings on the box. And I said, what's the story here? And we were with a tour guide, and he told us the story. And the story went something like this. There was once a very strong monk. A monk is somebody, who devotes himself, like a priest, devotes himself to prayer all through his life. And he was at the end of his life, and he was tired of all the fighting that he had done. So he had retired and became a monk. He was very strong. The problem was with this monk was that he was very loud, and monks have to be quiet. And he ate a lot of food, and monks aren't supposed to eat a lot of food. And he was always breaking things around the monastery where he lived. And so one day, his boss sent him out into the forest and said, go take these books with this donkey to this other place. And he was like, no problem. And then somebody took him aside and said, you can't do that. There are murderers in that forest, and they will kill you. And he said, murderers, ha! I'll chop their heads off. And they said, no, you're a monk now. You can't fight. And he says, even if they try to take my jacket? And they say, even if they try to take your jacket? And he says, even if they try to take my cloak, like my clothes? I said, why would they try to take your clothes? But yes, even if they try to take your clothes, you can't fight back. And he says, even if they try to take my underwear? I'm not making this up. This is really the story. And they go, why would they try to take your underwear? But then they're like, well, no, being naked in front of strangers is a sin against God, so you can fight back if they take your underwear. And he says, great, I'll cut their heads off. And they say, no, you cannot use any weapons. You can only fight with flesh and bone. And he says, no problem. So he goes back to his room, and these days, I'm going to talk about underwear for a minute. I apologize, everybody. These days, in our underwear, we have elastic, right, that like makes it stretchy. But in the old days, they didn't have elastic, so they had to use a belt. So he took the belt out of his underwear, and he took out a golden belt that he owned, a belt made of gold, and he put that in his underwear to hold it up. And then he put on his cloak, and he put on his jacket, and he took the donkey and the bags of books he needed, and they went out into the forest. And pretty soon, sure enough, the murderers showed up. And they all surrounded him with bows and arrows and swords and axes. And he said, they said, "Give us your money." And he said, "Oh, you can have my money as long as you don't take my jacket." And they're like, "Why? All right, give us your jacket." And he's like, "Okay, you can have my jacket." He gives them his jacket, "as long as you don't take my cloak." And they're like, "Why would we want your cloak?" And he's like, "Well, I'm glad you don't want it." And he said, "All right, give us your cloak." So he gives them the cloak. And then they see that he has a golden belt in his underwear, and they say, "Ah, now we see why you didn't want to give us your cloak. Give us your underwear." And he says, "Now you're for it." And I'm not going to make up any of these details. These are all the original details from the medieval story. He grabs two of them and smashes their heads together, and their heads explode. He picks up another one by his legs and smashes him against a tree, and he dies. And he starts punching them and kicking them. They're just dying left and right. It's like the bloodiest action movie you've ever seen. And then he looks up, and there are 10 men with bows and arrows all surrounding him. Now, he's strong, but his skin isn't made of metal, so he's going to die. So he turns around to the donkey that he has. And I apologize. In fact, if this part is going to be upsetting to you, you can take your fingers and close your ears. I don't want anyone to get upset. Please close your ears if you're upset. He grabs one leg of the donkey, and he rips it off the donkey. And he beats all of the archers to death with the donkey's leg, because the donkey's leg is made of flesh and bone. And then he takes the donkey's leg, and he puts it back on the donkey, and the donkey is fine. And that is the first miracle that he performed in his path to becoming a saint. Not exaggerating. So when I heard that story, I was like, oh, I'm putting that in a book. So that is in this book, The Inquisitor's Tale, which sounds like entertainment, and it is. But there's also some more serious themes in this book. I would like to read to you just the inscription of this book, just the epigraph, the little thing that comes in the beginning. So there are two lines from two different poems. I'm going to read them to you, and then I'm going to ask you to tell me what you think they mean. So you have to be listening hard and putting on your thinking brain. Are you ready? I couldn't hear you. Are you ready? Yes. Much better. Okay. The first one is from a poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins called Pied Beauty. And the line is, "Glory be to God for dappled things, all things counter, original, spare, strange." So in short, glory be to God for things that are strange. The second one is from W.H. Auden's poem, As I Walked Out One Evening, that goes, "You shall love your crooked neighbor with your crooked heart." Okay, so first one, glory be to God for dappled things, all things counter, original, spare, strange. What does that mean? Who can explain to me what they think that means? Glory be to God for things that are strange. Why should we be glorifying to God things that are strange? Who's brave enough to give their opinion on that subject? Yes, I see a courageous person right over here. Go ahead.
Because it's not boring.
Ah, I love that. So strange things are not boring. Yeah, I agree with that, absolutely. Anybody else wanna? In the back. Okay, can you shout your answer? Yeah.
It's because strange things will give an aspect of mystery, and that can make the plot more complex.
Yes, I love that. Strange things can give mystery and make it more complex, also less boring. Yes, why should we God bless strange things?
Because you don't have to wait for perfection to love something.
Oh, I love that. You don't have to wait for perfection to love something. Anyone else want to answer that one? I would add one more thing. It's unique. Yeah. I'm strange. Are you strange? Do you feel different from everyone else? Do you feel like everyone you know, if in fact they really showed themselves, would be strange? Okay, here's the next one. You shall love your crooked neighbor with your crooked heart. Why your crooked neighbor and why your crooked heart? Who can help me understand that one? Be brave. I see over. Yes, go ahead.
Ron?
Yeah, just speak loud.
Because we all think we're perfect and the other person is imperfect. And so
Talk about strange, yeah. The answer was, if you couldn't hear it, we all think we're perfect and that other people are imperfect. But in fact, we're all imperfect. We all have crooked hearts, and so does everyone else. So glory be to God for all us crooked weirdos out here. This is who we are, right? And so this book is about 3 different kids who all come from very different backgrounds. A religious boy whose father was Christian and mother was a Muslim African. A Christian peasant girl, very poor girl, and a Jewish boy, and a holy dog. All of them are different, and yet all of them are beautiful in their own ways. All right, next book. Next series of books. So this is my series, The Unicorn Rescue Society. This is usually for I would say 7 to 12-year-olds, whereas the previous books are more like 10 and up. And it's a series about 2 kids who travel around the world rescuing mythical creatures from danger. Every book, they go to a different place. They learn about the culture, they learn about the language, they learn about the food, and they learn about the mythology, including the mythical creatures. And so what I did when I wrote these books, they're fun. They're funny, they're fast, they're silly. There's a lot of poop jokes. I don't know if you like poop jokes. I personally love poop jokes, so there's a lot of them. But also, when I was trying to do them, I worked with a bunch of really interesting people. So my illustrator is a man named Hatem Ali. Hatem is an Egyptian guy who now lives in Canada, a Muslim guy, and a brilliant illustrator and very wise person. And so he added a lot to the books. He also was the illustrator of Inquisitor's Tale, a lot to the books from his very different perspective. I'm a Jewish guy from America. He's a Muslim guy from Egypt. And together we shared our visions for both for Inquisitor's Tale and Unicorn Rescue Society. Furthermore, when I was writing about each of those books in Unicorn Rescue Society, I co-wrote them with authors from the cultures or the countries that I was writing about. So, for example, Joseph Bruchac is a Native American storyteller from upstate New York. We wrote the Sasquatch book together. David Bowles is a Mexican-American guy from the border of Mexico and Texas. Emma Otegi is Cuban-American. We wrote about Cuba together. And Hannah Khan's family is from Pakistan. And so we worked together on the book Secret of the Himalayas. And I learned a lot when I was working with them. So, for example, when I was working with Joe on this first book, we had to write one paragraph about the Indian schools in America. The Indian schools are not India like this India, but about Native Americans. But they were called Indian schools because we called Native Americans Indians in the old days. And in these Indian schools, they would take kids away from their families and try to teach them to be white. And their motto was, kill the Indian, save the man. In other words, make sure they have no Indian culture, Native American culture in them so that they can be saved because they'll be like white people. Obviously, this is a disgusting piece of American history. There are many disgusting pieces of American history. This is one of them. Well, when we were writing about this, it happened to fall in a chapter that I was going to write. So I said, Joe, do you want to write that paragraph or 2 and send it to me? And he said, no, you write it and I'll fix it if it needs fixing. So I did my best to write 2 paragraphs about the Indian schools, and I sent it to him, and he wrote back to me and he said, this was wonderful and beautifully written and completely wrong. And I was like, oh, oops. So he fixed it and wrote it, and that's okay. In fact, it was great that he was able to do that and he was able to tell me. And in the process of this book, he told me a Native American saying, which actually also exists in ancient Rome, same saying. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth, which means that we should listen twice as much as we speak. And doing this series of books with these authors was a process of listening twice as much as I was speaking. And that was very much the case in writing the book with Henna Khan, The Secret of the Himalayas. So as I said, her family is Pakistani. She's a Muslim woman. And it was very important to her. Pakistan, I don't know what Pakistan's sort of depiction is in India. I'm sure it's very fraught. In the United States, most often when we hear about Pakistan, we hear about extremism, we hear about violence. And it was very important to Henna that, I'll call on you a little later, I promise, okay? It was very important to Henna that we showed another side of Pakistani culture, that we showed the side of Pakistani culture that she was familiar with, which was taking care of visitors, taking care of strangers, hospitality. 15 minutes left? Oh my gosh, I'm going long. Okay, and so we wanted to, so Henna and Hatem worked together really carefully to create these images of what it was like, of sharing food, of sharing tea, of men at prayer, in order to show, like in between all of our silly poop jokes, in order to show Pakistani culture as she understands it. And then Max in the Land of, in the House of Spies, which came out last year, and Max in the Land of Lies, which is the new book which comes out in February. I'm going to read to you a little bit of that book, and then I'm going to open it up. Then we're going to have a little bit of a conversation, and I will hopefully have some time for questions too. So this book, Max, is a Jewish boy who escapes Nazi Germany and gets sent to England, a country he's never been to. He does not speak the language. He doesn't know anyone there. And he gets placed with a Jewish family, and the Jewish family just happens to have an uncle who is a spy, a very important and powerful spy, and he's a real guy. So Max is a fictional character, but the spy uncle was a real dude, and so I write about him. Max on his shoulders has these two creatures who are my wonderful introducers talked about, Stein and Berg. Stein is a Dybbuk, so he's in Jewish culture. They attach themselves to you and make your life miserable. Berg is a kobold, and kobolds sort of go to where you live or where you work and make your life miserable. So lucky for Max, he has them both. And their job is just to make his life miserable. So you'll hear a little bit about them, but also about Max at his new English school, where there is an Indian boy, a boy of Indian descent, Harold Wadia. And the Wadia family, you may have heard of them. They're a real family, and they really had kids in these schools, though Harold is invented. So, Thursday was the tryouts for the rugby team. Max stood at the edge of the field in a leafy park near the center of London, a few minutes' walk from the rest of the school. You know what? We only have 15 minutes left, and I've realized this is going to take too long. So I'll read to you just the part where he's talking to Harold. Okay. So Harold is trying to help him survive in this school. And he says to Max, he says, "Just remember," Harold went on, "you've got it lucky." Max turned to him in disbelief because the kids are being really anti-Semitic to him, and they'd just beaten him up in the rugby trials. Both of the kids just got beaten up in the rugby trials. Max turned to him in disbelief. "Don't give me that look," said Harold. "If you can just keep your mouth shut, you look rather English, don't you? Eventually, they'll forget about you." Max's expression changed. Harold was speaking, but mostly to himself now. "They can't forget what I am, and they won't let me forget. Just keep quiet, and they'll let you alone eventually." Max, trying to control his ragged breath, said, "I'm kind of sick of keeping quiet." Harold raised an eyebrow. And that will begin the revenge plan that Max has on these bullies in his school. So these are spy novels, and they're supposed to be fun and exciting, but also they take on some real themes of discrimination, not just by the Germans, who Max escaped from, but by the English. So, should books for young people be entertaining, or should books for young people explore hard truths? What do you think? She says, both, obviously. I agree. If you are writing a book and you are trying to make it like deep and complex and philosophical, but it's boring, what's the point? No kid is going to read that. But if you're able to write a book that is funny and exciting and kids are turning the pages and they can't stop, you have their attention, you might as well do something valuable with that attention. Now, what I don't recommend you do is preach to the kids, is tell them what they should believe about something. Because as soon as you tell them what they should believe, they will stop listening. My editor told me not too long ago, she said, you know, Adam, she said, your best books tend to be the ones where you are exploring a question that you don't know the answer to. When I don't know, when I'm asking a hard question like, how should people who are different live together in, let's say, the Middle Ages? Or what happens when your parents do something terrible like cut off your head and put it back on again, like in A Tale Dark and Grim? Like, how should you forgive your parents? And I don't know the answer. That's the books that are richer and more interesting because it gives the readers space to solve it themselves. So that's my answer to should you do entertaining books or should you do books that express hard truths? The answer is obviously both. We have some time left. I really wanted to make sure we left time for questions. And I see that we have one guy you've been waiting to raise your hand, say something for a long time. Before I get to you though, we've all been sitting for a while. It's very hot. And so I would like everyone to do this. Take your fingers and hold them like this. Let me see your fingers. Good. Okay? Without leaving your seats, please raise your fingers in the air as high as you can. Higher! 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 Okay, now bring your arms down and squeeze yourself. Like give yourself a hug like you love yourself so much. Okay, shake your hands in your lap. Shake it faster. Shake it faster. Shake it faster. Now put them in the air. Now put them in your laps. You guys looked ridiculous. All right. We have one question back there to start, and then I'm sure we have more. I hope we have more. So get your questions ready. But we're going to start with the guy who gave one of the great answers to an earlier question of mine. Raise your hand, buddy, so he can see you. Yeah.
So I wanted to say that in our library class, we got to read The Secret of the Himalayas, and we had to make a book review on it. And I have another book here as well. And I really like the series, but I had a question about it.
Yes. Was the book review good? Did you write something positive or negative? Oh, that sounds bad.
It was good.
It was good? I better be good. I'm
Yeah.
standing right here. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead. What's your question?
I had a question. How do you format humor and seriousness in a book while trying to explain topics that people don't know?
What an amazing question. Can we give a round of applause for that fantastic question? Yeah. So essentially, my talk was saying you should make it funny and also explore tough things at the same time. And your question is, yeah, but how? Right? I don't know. To me, the most important thing is to, first of all, ask questions I don't know the answer to, and then tell a story that explores those questions. And when I'm telling that story that explores those questions, I think about you. I think about the young people that I'm writing the story for, and I try to tell them a good story. And if it's a good story, my secret to good stories, I'm going to tell you right now, you should write this down, this is genius right here. A character that everyone cares about, terrible things happen to that character. Those terrible things should be sometimes scary and sometimes funny because they're so ridiculously terrible. And then the main character finds a way to triumph over those terrible things. If you can do those 4 elements, people will love your book. So I try to think of a tough question, tell a story to kids with those elements. That's how I do it. Great question. All right, who else has another question? Yes. Here, you can share mine.
Why do you think series works better for children's literature and not as well for adults? I mean, to do 5 books or 4 books, it doesn't really work for adults, or very rarely does. So why do you think that?
Well, that's interesting. Maybe I question the premise because there are certain adult, like, genre series that work very well, like Game of Thrones, right? People ate that up. And certainly like detective novels, Hercule Poirot is in many. But I think children, young people, when they're reading a book, want to master an idea or an experience. You know, this thing is funny to me, and it's so funny to me because it's surprising. It's something that I haven't seen before, right? My daughter is 8 years old, and she will come home from school, and she will say something to us that happened, and we're like, you know, and to us, it's so old. Yeah, we used to say that on the playground too. But for her, it's brand new, and it blew her mind. And so when a kid has an experience that blows their mind, they want to have it over and over again. You remember when your kids were tiny, right? They wanted to read the same picture book over and over and over again, and then suddenly they were done with it. Because they were trying to master that amazing experience that had blown their mind until they had fully integrated it, and they got it, and they could put it away. Adults tend to be able to incorporate the new experiences a little more quickly because we're adults, and so we get it in that book, and if you're going to do it again and again, maybe it's a comfort to read another one that's similar. Like Agatha Christie for me is a comfort read, right? But I'm not trying to learn something new from the 8th Hercule Poirot novel. But for kids, they really want to process a new idea. I think that's why. Great question. And I think you had one too.
Yeah, you mentioned having lots of ideas from when you were a kid, right? And then you became a writer. So how do you decide what inspiration is worth a book? Just given the variety you've written about, right? Like grimness in fairy tales, World War, indigenous population, inspired stories. So very big variety in what you've written.
Yes, thank you. There is a big variety in what I've written, and sometimes I regret that because it makes it tougher in the book sales, right? When you my friend Stuart Gibbs has written, 50 spy novels, and the kids know what they are, and they take up a huge amount of space on the shelf, and his name is right next to mine, Gibbs and Gidwitz. That guy, I swear to God. But I like to jump around because I like to get excited about a story or a question, and then I want to dive into it. But it is a great question. Like, how do you know if it's going to be good enough? So I get my ideas while I'm writing another book, right? So I'll be writing another book, and then I'll come across a story about a super strong monk with a golden belt who smashes people's heads together and they explode. And I'm like, oh, I got to write that book. But I'm in the middle of another one. So what I do is I email myself, and the subject of the email is the working title of the new project. So that working title, that project, Inquisitor's Tale, was originally called Saints in my head. I didn't think that was really going to be the title, but that's how I thought of it. And then whenever I discovered something cool that kind of fit with Saints, I would email myself and label it Saints. So when I heard the story about a dog that died and came back to life, I was like, oh, Saints. And then again and again and again. And eventually, by the time I finished the previous book, and I've got some space to think, what's my next project? Maybe I've already got 200 emails to myself under the category of Saints. Or maybe I've got 30 in this category and 30 in this category, and I have to think, is either one of these inspiring enough? But if I've got 200 emails under that one subject, I know that question or that story is so exciting to me that I can't stop thinking about it, and that's good enough reason to write a book. Great question. I've never thought of what the answer was, so I'm glad we figured that out together. Here, and then we'll go next in the back, and then, okay. Here, and then there. She can go? Okay, very nice of you.
Okay. Yeah, you were talking about making it fun and telling the truth. Just curious how to engage teenagers, because that's a very difficult phase, a lot of changes happening. So how does one engage them through the written word?
Yeah, great question. I think honestly, the way to engage teenagers, which is a difficult time, is you have to be asking the right questions. If you're asking the questions that they actually care about, right? So my question about discrimination in England, right? As you'll probably know, from the United States perspective, during World War II, England were the good guys. We fought with them and we beat the Nazis. Good. But I'm sure from the Indian perspective, England in the 1940s is not a very positive or an entirely positive story, right? Quite the contrary. So I was very interested in exploring the double-edgedness of England's role in the world in that book. But that may not be a question that a 15-year-old is super interested in. Maybe there are some that it is, but for other 15-year-olds, they really want to understand, I'm at a party, and my friend does something that I think is really wrong, and I don't know what to do. Should I tell someone or not? And so when they open a book about that subject, they go, I want to know how they figured this out, and they'll read it. So it's about the right questions. Great question. Yes, that's, speaking of right questions, that was. Yes?
Right. There's a follow-up to that, honestly, in that how do you compartmentalize, like, in the market right now, there is a framework to say, like, 5 to 9 or, like, 7 to 10, and then you said, like, this book is, like, for 10 and up,
10 and
I'd
up,
say.
yeah.
Like, what topics, and you seem a little unconventional in that, like, what topics is a little too gore for, like, say, a 7-year-old or a 9-year-old, you know?
Yeah.
Like, how do you go through that process? Is it just you deciding, or is it then, like, the editors and the publications that, like, decide that?
You know what's great about that question is you totally caught me in a lie. I don't believe what I said at all, but it is a publishing convention. So I think that the stories in this series are most fun for 7 through 10 or 11-year-olds because they explore the kinds of questions and have the kinds of humor that those kids would like. And I said that this book is 10 and up, but that was a publishing decision because I know lots and lots of 7 and 8-year-olds who love this book because it explores the questions of parents and children and what do you do when your parents let you down. And every 7 or 8-year-old has felt that way. Now, this book, which is really a historical book about different types of people in the Middle Ages, is a little bit far afield and abstract for an 8-year-old. And so for them, this one's tough. Not because the writing level is different at all, it isn't. But the kinds of questions are more abstract for them, less concrete. That's how I think about it. Yeah, good question. And in the back, yeah.
Hello, yeah. What was your approach to writing about culture so different from your own?
Yeah, so my approach was relying on my co-author. So when the process for those books, so for example, in The Secret of the Himalayas, I approached Henna because I know her other books. She's a wonderful author, and I know her. She's a wonderful person. And I said, would you like to write a book together in the Unicorn Rescue Society series? And she said, very much. And I said, great. We always have one mythical creature in the book. What creature do you want to write about? And then she came up with 3 or 4 ideas, and we discussed them, we debated them. I went down to her house, which was, in a different state, and we sat around her giant black table, and we just debated what would be the best. And ultimately, it was her decision. And then when we plotted it, I talked about what the shape of most Unicorn Rescue Society books is. They start a certain way. They're sort of an, like a episodic, no, not episodic, like procedural. Well, this is going to happen, then this is going to happen, then this is going to happen. But the details of what that was going to be in relation to Pakistan was up to Henna, with me working with her to make sure that it fit into the voice and sound of the book. So in general, my process about writing about other people's cultures is to have 2 ears and only 1 mouth. Listen more than I speak. Okay, I see another question right here. Yes, great.
So one of the things that I struggled with your books, and I loved it, but I was wondering how you're thinking about it. Fairy tales were cleaned up for a long time.
Yes.
And they were, these nice, clean versions that we had, happy endings. And then the Grimm's tales were gory.
Yes.
But you just took them and you put them all together, wove it into a trilogy,
yeah,
and then made them gorier and gorier and gorier. There was this, I think it was the 3rd book, where there was this bit about Hansel or Gretel or someone, and the skin being taken off, and the skin being put onto something else and stitched up.
That sounds terrible. No one should read that.
It was a very Silence of a Lambie kind
yeah,
of,
sounds like
thing.
it.
So I'm wondering, no, it's in your book.
Apparently, I don't remember that. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just wondering how you think about that, and and how do you, what's your advice to adults that are discussing it? Kids love it.
Yeah.
But what's your advice to adults?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the key to my answer is the last thing that you said, which is that kids love it. Now, if they don't love it, then it's a problem. There are plenty of kids' books. I read a kid's book as a kid that really disturbed me and upset me. And I did not like that. But I believe firmly that kids know what they need. Just like we talked about how picture books with your little ones, they say, I want to read it again and again and again, and then I don't want to read it anymore. They could tell that there was something in it that they needed. The greatest thing about a book is every time you open it, you close it. Closing a book is the easiest possible thing to do. Unlike a movie or a TV show that comes at you fast and furious and you can't stop it before you see something upsetting, in a book, if you're not liking it, you close it. Everyone does. Furthermore, kids have this amazing thing that they do where they read something and they let parts of it go over their head. So there is a chapter in my first book that 4th graders read and think is scary, and 7th graders read and are like, that was the creepiest thing I've ever read, because they got something different out of it. But the 4th graders, it went over their head, and that's good. So kids, I believe we have to trust them. And if they say, I didn't like it, we trust them. And if they say, I need to read it again and again, there's something in it that they're processing. That's what I think. Any other questions? I don't know how much time we have. Are we done? Okay, one last question, and then I don't want to take anyone else's time.
So, it was an earlier question, are you responding to what, are you the chef or the waiter? Are you responding, or are you originating the stories? Do you think trying to guess what kids want, or are you telling kids what you want?
Great question. That's an amazing question. A bit of both. I am originating the story. I'm talking about what I want to talk about, and part of what I think makes my books successful is that inside I'm a 10-year-old boy. And so when I'm alone, my thoughts are most like a 10-year-old boy's thoughts. And so what I like, they tend to like. But there have been times when I had to listen to the kids. The very first edition of my second book, In a Glass Grimly, there is a frog in it, a talking frog. And the main character, and somebody picks up the frog and throws him against a wall, and his leg comes off. And in the previous book, A Tale Dark and Grim, my first book, the two main characters get their heads cut off in the first chapter and put back on, and they're fine. And all the kids loved it. But this one, the frog got hurt. And I have a narrator who tries to take care of the kids. And the narrator says in the second book about the frog, don't worry, I know this wasn't very bloody. Don't worry, it'll get bloodier. Well, I got some letters. In fact, the very famous author Jacqueline Woodson, her daughter, wrote to me and said, don't hurt animals. And I was like, the kids got their heads cut off in the last book. This frog just lost his leg. But she was upset, and other kids were too. And I messed up. And so I said to my publisher, I rewrote the narrative part, and I said, instead, don't worry, I know you're upset about the frog. He will be okay. No, he will be better okay than okay. He will be awesome. And I put that in the book, and the second printing from then on has that different narrative interjection, and I never got another angry letter about the book. So sometimes you just have to listen to the kids. You think you get it right, and you don't. All right, thank you all so much for being here and being such a wonderful audience and your great questions. I really appreciate it.